According to the Barbarossa Plan, the capture of Moscow was expected within the first 3 to 4 months of the war. However, the stubborn defense of the Soviet troops near Smolensk and the lagging flanks forced the German command to suspend the offensive on the Soviet capital. And only after the capture of Kiev and the breakthrough to Leningrad, Hitler ordered that all main forces be thrown at Moscow. The German command prepared a major offensive operation codenamed Typhoon. The plan for the operation called for the defeat of the main forces of the Red Army defending Moscow before the onset of winter. To achieve this, it was planned to dismember the defense of the Soviet troops with 3 powerful attacks by tank groups. Encircle and destroy the Soviet armies in the areas west of Vyazma and east of Bryansk, then use strong mobile groups to outflank Moscow from the north and south and, in cooperation with troops advancing from the front, capture the capital of the Soviet Union. As in most defensive operations of 1941, the main problem for the Red Army troops was the uncertainty of the German command's plans. The Germans were expected to advance on Moscow along the Smolensk highway, as this would facilitate the movement of the thousands of vehicles of the motorized corps. However, in the battle for Moscow, the German command decided to rely on surprise and secretly transferred Colonel General Erich Hoepner's 4th Tank Group from Leningrad. For the first time in history, 3 tank groups operated simultaneously in one direction. By the end of September 1941, Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock's Army Group Center numbered 1,800,000 men and was armed with 1,700 tanks, over 14,000 guns and mortars, and nearly 1,500 aircraft. The Soviet troops defending Moscow were organized into 3 fronts: Western, Colonel General Konev; Bryansk, Colonel General Eremenko; and Reserve, Marshal Budyonny. The troops of the 3 fronts numbered 1,250,000 people, were armed with about 1,000 tanks, more than 7,500 guns and mortars. Operation Typhoon began early in the morning of September 30, 1941. German tank groups under the command of Guderian and Hoepner struck in the south, in the outskirts of Bryansk. Avoiding frontal attacks, the Germans advanced to the rear of our troops and, within 3 days, completely encircled the main forces of Eremenko's Bryansk front. On October 3, Oral was abandoned. Exploiting the resulting gap, German tanks rushed toward Tula. Guderian's deep breakthrough forced the Red Army command to take the most urgent measures. A landing force was dropped in Oral. The paratroopers, having straddled the Oral-Mtsensk highway, entered into battle with the advanced units of the Wehrmacht. T-34 tanks under the command of Colonel Katakov soon arrived to reinforce the paratroopers. Katakov decided to set an ambush, allowing Guderian's advance units to pass. The Soviet tankers suddenly attacked the Germans from the flanks and rear. In total, Katakov's 4th Tank Brigade destroyed 133 German combat vehicles in the battles near Mtsensk. The time gained allowed Katakov's brigade to strengthen the defense of Tula. The assault on Little Moscow by Guderian's army units proved unsuccessful. Meanwhile, the time had come for the main attack. Tank groups and field armies of Army Group Center fell upon the reserve western fronts near Roslavl and Dukovshchina. German tank wedges broke through our defenses and rushed towards each other. 2 days later, the ring was finally closed. Near Vyazma, 5 Soviet armies fell into the cauldron. In total, near Bryansk and Vyazma, the Germans encircled 2/3 of all our troops in the western direction, defeating 3 Soviet fronts. On October 10, German troops rushed towards Kalinin and by the 17th had captured the city. And the next day, Mozhaysk and Maloyaroslavets were abandoned. At the same time, when the scale of what had happened became clear, Stalin summoned Army General Zhukov from besieged Leningrad. Arriving at the front and quickly familiarizing himself with the situation, Zhukov made a terrible conclusion. The defensive front in the western direction essentially no longer existed. All roads to Moscow were, in essence, open. The last line of defense on the way to the city was the Mozhaysk defense line under construction 120 kilometers from the capital. Zhukov sent all the combat-ready units he could find in Moscow to defend the Mozhaysk lines. Among them were cadets from 6 Moscow military schools. The intelligence department of the Army Group Center headquarters was already anticipating victory in mid-October. However, the German motorized units that had broken ahead on the Mozhaysk line encountered unexpected stubborn resistance from the Soviet troops. On the same Borodino field, Where the general battle with Napoleon's Grande Armée unfolded in 1812, fierce battles took place again in October of 1941. The 32nd Rifle Division of Colonel Polasukin, which arrived from the Far East, fought with the SS men from the Das Reich Motorized Division. Positional battles on the Mozhaisk defense line continued for several days. The SS Motorized Division Das Reich suffered significant losses. On the Borodino field, the commander of the SS division, Paul Hauser, lost an eye. Nearby, near Maloyaroslavets, the Podolsk cadets fought on the Ilyinsky lines. Armed with carbines and machine guns, with virtually no logistical support, the cadets held off the enemy for nearly 2 weeks. After several days of fighting, the enemy managed to advance only 300 meters. Having stopped their frontal attacks, German tanks moved toward the Podolsk cadets from the rear, but immediately came under direct fire from heavy anti-aircraft guns positioned directly in front. By mid-October, the Red Army troops managed to bring the front to a state of stable equilibrium. The report of the 57th Panzer Corps of the Wehrmacht stated that the last battles for the capture of Russian positions were the most brutal of the entire period, since the enemy put up fierce resistance, having fortified itself in concrete permanent structures built in peacetime. In turn, the troops of Konev's newly formed Kalinin front stopped the advance of the German Ninth Army. Cadets and fresh divisions were not the only defenders of Moscow. Large forces of Army Group Center in the decisive days of mid-October 1941 were tied down in battles with the Soviet armies encircled near Vyazma and Bryansk. They held back 24 German divisions along the 300-kilometer encirclement perimeter. During the battles with the encircled units and divisions of the Red Army, the Germans lost time and were now forced to overcome roads that had become muddy after the rains. Later, von Bock noted with frustration that the troops of Army Group Center were gradually becoming stuck in the mud and swamps. Later, the failure of the Wehrmacht's October offensive on Moscow was attributed solely to weather conditions. However, it is obvious that during the muddy rainy season, the roads had an equally negative effect on both sides. By early November 1941, the front on the approaches to Moscow had already gained sufficient stability, but it was still too early to talk about the success of the defense of Moscow. On November 7, on the anniversary of the October Revolution, a military parade was held on Moscow's Red Square. Many parade participants went straight from the square to the front lines. The parade had enormous political significance, as the government of the Soviet Union and the Supreme Commander-in-Chief personally demonstrated their determination to fight to the end. Less than a week after the parade on Red Square, troops of the German Army Group Center received orders to resume their offensive on Moscow. With the arrival of cold weather in mid-November, the ground froze, and now tanks could move off-road. The divisions spearheading Army Group Center's offensive received warm uniforms. The order from the 4th Panzer Group stated, "The days of waiting are over, we can advance again. We now only have to destroy Moscow's last line of defense." By the start of the new German offensive, Moscow's defenses had been significantly strengthened. Military intelligence data made it possible to withdraw divisions from the Far East. Meanwhile, the German command, due to the losses it had suffered, considered the plan to encircle Moscow unrealistic. The 3rd and 4th Tank Groups were concentrated on the left flank of Army Group Center in the area of Kalinin and Volokholamsk. They were supposed to push the Soviet troops back to the Lama River, capture the crossings in the western part of the Volga Reservoir and develop an offensive in the direction of the Moscow-Volga Canal. In fact, in the November offensive, instead of the encirclement battle traditional for German tactics, a simple breakthrough was carried out in the direction of Moscow. In turn, on November 18, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was supposed to resume the offensive through Tula to the northeast, in the direction of Kolomna. A significant drawback of this plan was the choice of the direction of the main attack, which passed through a wooded area to the northwest of Moscow. This significantly limited the maneuver of German tank formations. Nevertheless, the concentration of 2 tank groups at once in one direction did its job. The Red Army's defense near Volokholamsk was broken in the course of fierce fighting. The 3rd Tank Unit of the 4th Panzer Group advanced from the north, bypassing the Istra Reservoir, towards Klin. Another unit of the 4th Panzer Group advanced from Volokholamsk towards Istra. However, the collapse of the Soviet front, similar to the October catastrophe, did not occur. Under pressure from German tanks, Red Army units retreated in an organized manner from line to line, towards the Istra Reservoir in Klin. At this time, Lieutenant General Rokossovsky, commander of the 16th Army, received permission from the General Staff to withdraw troops to the Istra line. However, soon after, Western Front Commander Zhukov rescinded the order to withdraw troops beyond the Istra Reservoir and ordered that the line be held to the end. Their German opponents, Colonel Generals Erich Hoepner and Georg Hans Reinhardt, settled this dispute by outflanking the Istra Reservoir from the north on November 24 and capturing Klin and Solnechny-Gorsk, located 50 kilometers northwest of Moscow. This was a major success for the German forces. A real threat of encirclement loomed over Rokossovsky's units on the Istra line. Moreover, German tank and infantry divisions could break through to the capital from the north through Solnechny-Gorsk. Rokossovsky's army soon had to abandon the convenient line at the reservoir. In the last week of November, fierce battles took place with the German divisions rushing forward. Meanwhile, Guderian's units carried out a wide envelopment of Tula. A direct threat loomed over Kashira, the loss of which would have opened the road to the Soviet capital for German troops. However, the soldiers of the 2nd Cavalry Corps of Lieutenant General Belov, acting as infantry with the support of artillery, managed to stop the advance of the German tanks. In the last days of November, the commanders of the German forward units could already observe Moscow through binoculars. On November 30, motorcyclists from the Army Engineering Battalion broke through to Khimki. Only 8 kilometers remained to the outskirts of the Soviet capital. The neighboring 3rd Panzer Group Reinhardt reached the Moscow-Volga Canal, and with the right flank units occupied Krasnaya Polyana, from which to the center of Moscow was only about 30 kilometers. To the west of Moscow, the front line had remained unchanged since the beginning of November, and to the south, Guderian bypassed Tula, occupied the city of Venov and came close to Kashira. But the German troops did not advance any further. Their offensive capabilities had already been exhausted by that time. Conditions were created for the Soviet troops to launch a counteroffensive. Reserve armies began to advance toward the front line. And already on November 27, in the Kashira region and on November 29 north of Moscow, Soviet troops launched counterattacks against the southern and northern groupings of German troops. On December 5, troops from 3 Soviet fronts launched a general counteroffensive. During the counteroffensive, Wehrmacht units were pushed back 100 to 350 km from the capital. 3 days after the Red Army's offensive near Moscow began, Hitler was forced to sign a directive ordering German troops to go on the defensive along the entire Soviet-German front. In the Battle of Moscow, German troops suffered their first major defeat since the beginning of World War II. Summing up the results of the Battle of Moscow, the Chief of Staff of the 4th German Field Army, General Gunther Blumentritt, noted, "This was the turning point of our Eastern campaign." The hope of removing the Soviet Union from the war in 1941 collapsed at the very last minute.